Hello everyone, my name is Aditya. I'm one of the outreach coordinators at an organization called Animal Ethics. And today I'll be talking to you about a long-termist approach to animal advocacy. To give you a brief idea about what we'll be covering in today's talk, um, initially we look at why should we care about long-termism as people who care about doing good in the world. Why is long-termism an important idea? Two is we look at different forms of future risks for non-human animals in three different cases. One is animal exploitation, two is wild animal suffering, and three is new forms of suffering that don't exist today but might exist in the future. And finally, we look at some long-termist approaches that animal advocates and people who care about doing good in the world can adopt for changing the trajectory of the long-term future. To start off with, why long-termism? A lot of people in the EA movement are probably already aware of long-termism and why it's important to care about the long-term future. However, one might also have noticed that the conversation surrounding long-termism has mainly been focused on human beings, which is that it has mainly been anthropocentric. However, humans are not the only stakeholders in the far future. A significant percent of the beings that will exist in the far future would be non-human sentient beings. So it's quite important to also take their interests into account. But what is long-termism? Long-termism is basically the ethical view that positively influencing the long-term future is a key moral priority of our time. Now, why is that the case? Well, I lay down three basic premises for long-termism. One is that in the far future, there will be many more, when I say many more, astronomically many more sentient beings in the far future than compared to the number of beings that exist today. This is mainly because, we might have around a few trillion beings that exist today, but if you just aggregate the number of sentient beings that we can expect to come into existence in the next multiple centuries, they would, logically be much larger than the number of beings that exist today. So the amount of value or disvalue that could exist in the far future is astronomically huge compared to today. The second point is discriminating against someone's interests based on when they are born is unjustified. It is kind of similar to discriminating against someone based on where they are born or their geographic location. Basically, both of them are arbitrary criteria. A person who is born in the long-term future and their interests would count just as much as someone's interest who is born today, because they would basically suffer the same. And finally, what we do now could potentially change the trajectory or the direction of the future, which is that we have a non-trivial probability of influencing the trajectory of the far future. So if we combine the three things, then it makes sense that given that we can do something about changing the trajectory of the far future where there's an astronomical amount of value, we need to adopt an approach where we are influencing the state of the far future. So this is the basic case for long-termism. And usually when I present these arguments, there's some objections against long-termism. While there are some legitimate objections against long-termism, it is important to also be aware of some cognitive biases that might usually affect our ability to think critically about doing good. So especially doing good in the far future. So there's three biases that I'm highlighting here today, but there are many other biases that could also potentially affect our thinking when we are thinking about the long-term future. So the first one is the temporal bias towards the present or towards the near future as compared to the far future. We are psychologically predisposed to giving more importance to the present as opposed to the future. Again, this is not considering the value that will exist in the far future and today, but this is just a psychological blind spot that we have where we give more importance to the present or to the near future. But this does not mean that the far future does not matter a lot. The second one is called as the availability bias. This refers to giving more importance to things that are easier to imagine or to scenarios that are easier to recollect from our past memories. For example, if I asked you to think about, say, future based on the Terminator movie, it would be easier for you to imagine what such a scenario would look like. However, if I asked you to think about the far future, say 100,000 years later, you don't have any reference point or any memories that you can make use of to imagine how the far future would look like. This causes us to psychologically give more weight to scenarios that are easier to imagine as compared to scenarios that are harder to imagine. But this does not mean that just because we can't imagine the far future does not mean that it is not important. What matters is the amount of suffering or value that exists, or the number of sentient beings who would suffer in two different scenarios. So that is what is relevant here as opposed to what is easier to imagine. The third kind of cognitive bias is called as the evaluability bias. A lot of people who are focused on doing good effectively tend to give more weight to approaches or interventions that are easier to evaluate. And hence they would argue that because it's harder to evaluate long-termist approaches, given that the outcome of this would be in the far future, which is not possible to evaluate, we should give more weightage to the near-termist interventions. But this is not exactly coherent, mainly because what matters is not the ability to evaluate things, but what matters, as I said earlier, is the expected value that would exist in the far future as compared to today. There might be interventions or approaches that we can take today that are probably less valuable, evaluable, compared to certain other approaches towards near-termist interventions that are more valuable. But that does not mean that just because the long-term future is less evaluable, it matters less. As I said, given that the amount of value is huge there, we should take an expected value framework to prioritize interventions that could potentially have a huge impact in the long-term future. So these are some biases to keep in mind when we are deciding our position on long-termism. However, for the remainder of the talk, I intend to assume that you're relatively convinced about taking a long-termist approach and that the far future matters, and given that we can do something about it, we need to think about ways in which we can ensure that the trajectory of the far future is positive for all sentient beings. So moving on, let us now look at the future risks for non-human animals. As I said earlier, I'm going to highlight 3 different categories. 1 is animal exploitation, 2 is wild animal suffering, and 3 is newer types of animal suffering. So the first one, with respect to animal exploitation. In today's world, there's already tremendous amount of animal exploitation of different species, of huge number of sentient beings that are exploited in the animal industry. One example of this is of hens that are exploited in factory farms in the poultry industry. To give you some context, factory farming of animals didn't exist 50 years ago or 60 years ago. It only came into existence around 1940s or 1950s. Before that, it used to be mainly like grassland farming or backyard farming, as they would call it. So factory farming of non-human animals is only recent, where hens are put through tremendous amount of suffering. Huge number of billions of hens are exploited every year, and they are usually killed prematurely in horrible ways. While factory farming was coming into existence, the activists or the animal activists of that day were focusing on the present day issues of 1940s or 1950s. In this case, it is of dogs being experimented on in vivisection or in laboratories. So the activists were focusing on the present day issues of that time. Had they paid more attention to the development of factory farming, because industrialization was already at play, So if they had explored how animal agriculture industry is co-opting industrialization to bring into existence factory farming, they might have had more leverage and more power to change the potential trajectory of the factory farming as an institution. However, because they were focused on the present day issues of their time, they missed an opportunity to change the trajectory for billions of non-human animals' welfare. So this is one example where thinking about the far future could have had potentially huge impact. Now, how can animal exploitation be expanded in the future? One, it is possible that humans come up with a form of exploitation that increases the suffering of exploited animals. They might discover or invent a new way of producing more output from animals, which ends up causing more suffering to them. So that is one way. Two is increasing the number of exploited animals. Currently, factory farming is mainly focused on the first world countries or like the developing countries. It's possible that as the economic growth happens in the countries that are not developed currently, like say in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeastern Asia, and South America, it is possible that they also adopt factory farming technology and the number of animals that are exploited increases exponentially. Finally, it is also possible that humans develop newer forms of animal exploitation that don't currently exist today. One example of that, say recently, factory farming of aquatic animals has been gaining a lot of traction. This didn't exist a couple decades ago. This is relatively a newer phenomenon where the seeds of fishes are bred in small ponds and huge numbers of them are grown in small ponds. And similarly is the case with crustaceans like shrimps. Say for example, here in South India, the factory farming of shrimp is gaining a lot of popularity and a lot of farmers are shifting to factory farming these animals. And here again, this was a missed opportunity for activists, say 20 years ago. They didn't pay attention to how this industry was growing. If they had, they could have campaigned or created strategies that would prevent these factory farming industries from flourishing. So this is just to highlight the fact that there are many ways in which animal exploitation can grow exponentially, and by taking a long-termist approach or by thinking about what future risks could come up, we could potentially either prevent them from growing to that scale, or we can set some safeguards that future activists can make use of to improve the situation of animals in the future. Another industry that is right now in its infancy but is growing rapidly is the insect farming industry. Insects are mainly grown to feed other factory farmed animals currently, but it is also possible that in the future humans develop a taste for insects where they also start demanding insects for some nutritional content. And here the amount of suffering could be much larger because in a given amount of space, many more number of insects can be grown as compared to larger animals. So this is one thing that activists could also focus on to prevent the suffering of these sentient beings in the future. Now, the next category of future risks is that of wild animal suffering. Again, when I talk about wild animal suffering, this is different from wildlife extinction or conservation issues or biodiversity. Here, when we are talking about wild animals, we are focusing on sentient beings in the wild, not the biodiversity, not the ecosystem, but the individual well-being of non-human animals in the wild. And this is not just the suffering of animals caused by humans, but also the suffering of animals naturally, due to natural causes. Humans already do provide medical aid to animals in the wild. This could be through medical care or through helping animals during disasters or other situations during human-animal conflict. But we usually tend to grossly underestimate the amount of suffering that animals in the wild undergo due to natural reasons. To give you a few examples, again, to just flag it here, there might be a few distressing images of animals suffering in the next couple slides. So if you're uncomfortable, maybe you'd like to skip that. Yeah, so animals in the wild undergo suffering due to many natural reasons. It could be through starvation, thirst, it could be through diseases, where animals that are infected with diseases don't have access to medical aid and they usually end up dying in painful ways. It could also be through natural disasters, like I mentioned earlier, or weather events. It could be through interspecies competitions or intraspecies competitions. It could be through sexual conflicts. More importantly, it could also be through something called as their reproductive strategy. Sorry about that. Yeah, and yeah, sorry about that. I was just having some issues with the laptop. Yeah, animals in the wild have a particular form of reproductive strategy where they give birth to huge number of offsprings. Say in this case, a bullfrog gives birth to 10,000 babies, out of which less than 1% end up surviving to adulthood. The remaining 99% of these animals die when they are quite young, and they die usually in quite painful ways where they are eaten by predators, or they have parasites, or they end up dying in different natural ways that cause them a lot of pain. And most number of animals that exist in the wild reproduce in such ways where they give birth to huge number of offsprings and very few of them end up surviving. Yeah, so that's said, which is that the amount of suffering in the wild is huge, and the number of sentient beings in the wild is huge as well. It's estimated that there are close to 10 to the power 19 sentient beings in the wild if we include only the vertebrates, but if we include the invertebrates, the number is much larger. So this brings it into attention that how can wild animal suffering become much worse in the far future? So one, it is possible that the number of animals suffering very bad lives can be increased accidentally, or it could also be on purpose. To give you an example here, there was an experiment conducted by the Israeli spaceship where they sent some tardigrades onto the moon just to conduct an experiment. While most of these tardigrades didn't end up surviving and they ended up dying, it is possible that in the pursuit of scientific progress, humans end up sending wild animals to other planets or other celestial bodies where they end up spreading this suffering that exists in the wild to other planets. And once life goes there onto the other planets, the suffering there might increase a lot. So this is one example of humans accidentally spreading life, but it could also be possible that humans on purpose spread life to other planets for aesthetic reasons or for scientific reasons. This process of spreading wild animals on other planets purposefully is called as directed panspermia. There has already some work being done by some academics on this topic and the ethics of it. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you could check out some papers on directed panspermia. So that was wild animal suffering. And finally, let us look at newer forms of suffering which don't currently exist today. So this could be potentially of two types. One is it could be animals that are genetically designed that don't currently exist today. They could be a whole new species that scientists have genetically created to create a lot of output, whether it is milk, flesh, or whatever output that being is intended to produce. Or it could also be artificial sentient beings. When I usually say artificial sentient beings, people usually have a repulsive reaction, but it is very much possible that in the future, once AI is very sophisticated, it could potentially have the possibility of being sentient, and humans, in their pursuit of creating more and more sentient beings, they might create many more digital sentient beings, and might not give enough consideration to their well-being. So this is also a potential form of future risk where humans create a lot of digital sentient beings and put them through a lot of suffering. And insofar as us, as people who care about doing good, care about all sentient beings and the interests and suffering of all these beings, we should also care about the interests of digital sentient beings, and that should also be part of our strategy. And now that we have looked at all the different kinds of risks that can exist for non-human sentient beings, let us now look at some approaches that we can take as altruists to improve or to mitigate these risks. And before I go into that, again to highlight why should we care about these risks, because one, they are potentially huge in scale. The number of beings that will exist in the far future is huge. Two, while some of these cases might seem quite speculative, they are still non-negligible, which is that there is a possibility of these risks becoming a reality. Three, they are currently overlooked and not tackled. Most of these situations are currently neglected by most altruists, and very few people are actually discussing about these issues. So this makes it a very neglected topic, and we need more discussion on this. And what are the risk factors for future animals? Well, it could be divided into three categories. One is animals receive little moral consideration. This is mainly due to the attitude of speciesism, where people give less moral consideration to non-human animals as compared to humans. Two is that there is a demand for animal exploitation. It is not that humans want to cause suffering to animals, but it is mainly because they care about the products that comes out of animal exploitation. So as long as there is demand for animal exploitation, animals will continue to be exploited. And finally, environmentalist values would prevail over concern for wild animals. Currently, people care more about the ecosystem and the biodiversity over the well-being of individual sentient beings. So if the environmentalist values prevail, then there would be lesser concern for wild animal suffering and more concern for ecosystem preservation, which could be bad for the well-being of animals. So to tackle this, we propose two different kinds of approaches. One is called as a broad approach and the other is targeted approach. And in a broad long-termist approach, we look at three different categories. One is we focus on achieving and consolidating changes, the different kinds of changes that are occurring. We focus on consolidating them. Two is we promote giving consideration to all sentient beings as opposed to some sentient beings. And three is we make the situation better for future advocacy, for future animal advocates or future altruists to have more impact. So in the first category, we focus on, which is consolidating changes. So there might be two different ways of doing this. One is we focus on attitude change. We focus on spreading attitudes that promote caring about all sentient beings. Like anti-speciesism, in India we have something called as ahimsa, which means non-violence. So this could vary based on the cultures of different countries. So we focus on these cultural attitudes that promote giving consideration to all animals. Two is we reinforce attitude changes through institutional changes, which is coming up through laws, coming up with charities, coming up with institutional measures that protect the welfare of animals. And the second one is giving consideration to all sentient beings. So this it's usually when we animal activists focus on certain species in their advocacy. But when we take a long-termist approach, we make sure to give consideration to all sentient beings. In this case, it would be to include invertebrates as well as including conversation about wild animal suffering and promoting caring about the suffering of animals in the wild. And finally, we make the situation better for future advocacy. This could be in many different ways. One, by paying attention to the trends. So if we notice that a certain industry where animal exploitation occurs is growing faster, by paying attention to it and finding ways of solving that issue or combating the growth of that particular industry. 2 is promoting awareness and knowledge with other EAs, with other animal activists about caring about the long-term future. 3 is having a very open mind. As I said, a lot of these future risks sound very speculative. So it's important for us to have an open mind and to consider tiny probabilities of different scenarios occurring so that we are able to notice them and make sure that we are bringing that into attention of other animal activists. And finally, we look for promising targeted strategies. And that brings me to the second category or the second approach, which is targeted interventions. This could be through developing non-animal proteins. So one of the main reasons humans consume animals is for the nutritional needs. So developing cellular meat or developing non-animal proteins could help people switch from exploiting animals for food to these other options. And the second thing is preventing new forms of animal exploitation. Like I mentioned, fish farming or shrimp farming is a newer phenomenon. So if we notice that there are newer forms of animal exploitation coming into existence, we could focus our advocacy and campaigning on banning these activities. And finally, promoting the field of welfare biology. Welfare biology is the scientific study of studying the welfare of animals in the wild and how we can improve their welfare. Yeah, so these are some examples of targeted interventions that are currently tackled, which is there are charities that are currently working on these issues. If you would like to learn more about the importance of our future or about wild animal suffering, I would highly encourage you to check out our YouTube channel of Animal Ethics, where you can gain more information about this. There's also videos about ethics and sentience and different forms of animal exploitation that are present on our YouTube channel. So I think I would highly recommend you check that out. And finally, if you're also interested in getting text or literature on the topics that I recently spoke about, you can check out our ebook. It is available on our website, www.animalethics.org, and you can download it from there. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the work we are doing, I would recommend you check out our website, which I recently told. We also have our website in different languages, 12 different languages. We sadly don't have it in Japanese. So if any of you are interested in translating our website into Japanese, feel free to reach out to us and we can find a way to collaborate to release our website in Japanese. However, our organization is not the only one talking about this. There is a Center for Reducing Suffering, and if you're interested in learning more about their work, I would highly recommend you check out this podcast where they discuss about these topics in much more depth. Yeah, these are some other academic work done on like modal circle expansion to impact the far future. Finally, there's also a book that was written by the founder of Animal Ethics called Making a Stand for Animals, where we explore the topic of animal ethics in much more detail. So if you're interested in getting this book, feel free to reach out to us and we can send you a link on how you can access this book. That said, thank you so much for listening to this talk, and I hope this gave you new ideas, new inputs to think about on how you can do more good in the world and how you can influence the far future for non-human animals. If you have any questions or if you would like to reach out to me, feel free to mail me on this email ID. It's aditya.sk@animalethics.org. Thank you so much and have a great day.